Welcome to episode 5 of At Your Doorstep, the new FreightWaves show that is the complement to the newest FreightWaves brand, Modern Shipper. I'm your host, Kaylee Nix. On this show, we explore the world of last mile delivery, the gig economy, and tech, and how it all works together in one. Today, we're going to be looking at big tech and bureaucracy and figuring out why technology is so important when it comes to cross-border trade. Today on At Your Doorstep, we're talking to Richard Barnett, CMO of SupplyFrame. Thank you so much for joining me today, Richard. I'm very excited to have you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, Kaylee.
So first things first, give me a little bit of information on your background and then what you do with SupplyFrame.
Sure. So I've spent about 25 years in sort of the broad information technology enterprise business application space, but specifically focused around supply chain and the use of sort of enabling technology to drive digital transformation. And often that's new forms of decision making or intelligence. I've worked with very large and very small companies, and I've really enjoyed the work that we're doing more recently at SupplyFrame, because the focus here is around bringing new forms of intelligence to really transform what we call the design to source life cycle in the global electronics industry. We can tell you more about that.
So explain to me what that means, the design to source.
So you hear these terms like procure to pay or order to cash. They're typically these sort of shorthands for functional scope, typically within like an ERP or enterprise process. And what we believe is there's this opportunity to connect what are typically very siloed sets of activities, both within companies, whether it's global manufacturers or it's component suppliers and semiconductor companies, around how they engage and manage and optimize everything that happens from the design process. So when a design bill of materials being put into place for a new hardware application, all the way through its life cycle, into strategic sourcing and supply management of those active products as they're on the market. Because as we increasingly know, it's incredibly sort of challenging value chain, if you will, around the electronics value chain. It's multi-tiered. There's, interesting sort of dynamics around where there's consolidation of sort of supply and capacity, and it's truly global. And so all those component suppliers and semiconductor companies also need to transform how they're going to market. COVID was really interesting because it accelerated a lot of things that were taking a long time to sort of get into vogue or get into adoption. And a lot of that collapsed, maybe 3 to 5 years probably of what we would have seen got collapsed into about 1.5 years.
And so we talk about how supply chain visibility is super crucial, right? Unsiloing that data, breaking it down into things that are usable for all frames of that supply chain. How important, and what are some of the specific most sought after solutions that you guys are seeing right now?
It's a great question. I mean, I have the long view on this because I worked at a company called i2 Technologies back in the late 90s, and sort of this marketplace phenomenon that you saw in 2000s and 2001 was exciting, and we sort of all envisioned the future. And a big part of that future was this concept of everything being visible, everything being interconnected. But the technology wasn't ready. We underestimated the challenges around standardization, integration, for global supply chains. Now we've made a lot of progress over the last 20, plus 30 years, broadly in areas of logistics and transportation, because those are the areas that are the most shared and outsourced, right? So most companies, maybe they manage their own fleet for direct delivery to consumer or retail operations, but generally their inbound supply chains are coordinated by, multiple 3PLs or vendors across multiple modes, air, truck, ocean, et cetera. We've made a lot of progress there. There's been a huge amount of innovation, investment in technologies, et cetera. The overall challenge is that horizon is super tactical in the horizon, meaning once a shipment's been created, we have pretty good visibility and control, generally speaking, across things that are happening in the network from like major points of supply to the major manufacturer or major retailer and consumer. What we are still struggling with are all the risk factors that are outside of that operational horizon. So the things that are sort of driving longer term lead time changes or capacity or leading demand indicators that might show an increasing shift, that still remains very hazy. It's still hard, and it's still really critical to managing disruption and sort of agility and resilience in these global supply chains.
And that kind of seems like the common theme around everyone that I've talked to, both on this show and everyone else that comes on all of our other FreightWave shows, is that we're all talking about capacity problems are hard. Sourcing capacity is really, really difficult. Finding the ability to move your freight is so hard right now. And a lot of people, answers are really just like, well, it's just going to take time to untangle this web that we've created for ourselves. And so at Supply Frame, are you guys kind of, your goal is to help almost look into the future to see, okay, maybe if we start moving this string here and this string here, we can start to untangle that knot that's been brought to us by this pandemic and all these situations like what happened in the Suez Canal and the weather delays and stuff like that?
Right. Right. It is. I mean, think of if we were to operationalize risk intelligence broadly in global supply chains, that would be the broadest approach, right? It's just
Hmm.
generally trying to think through that. So one of the key trends is it's not good enough to just monitor risk events or risk signals. You actually have to sort of synthesize or translate what those signals are telling us about the context of decisions that I'm trying to make. So that's the really, getting to that final mile of contextual intelligence and trade-off analysis is one really critical element. The other really critical element is to constantly expand and absorb new forms of intelligence. So at Supply Frame, we have grown over time to really kind of be and see engagement across the global value chain. We have 10 million engineers and procurement professionals, linking into 70 different websites and vertical search engines that we have. And we can see all of this interesting leading indicator of popularity of what parts and components are the most popular, what's the geographic
Hmm.
mix, what's happening around leading indicators of demand. We also see when new design cycles are being created. And then we complement that with the other data that's accessible through our partnerships with, global inventory of distributors for that same, item or component on a global basis, real time. And then we look at what's happening with supply lead time more generally. And these are these longer lead time issues. And with the sort of the component supply shortage, the chip shortage that's really impacting automotive right now, there's an opportunity to see leading indicators of that maybe 4 to 5 months before it really hit most of the automotive OEMs. So that was one really interesting dynamic that we saw take place. But it's constantly evolving. So it's all about sort of broadening a risk perspective and really going outside in to gain new forms of intelligence and insight that companies oftentimes really struggle with, kind of getting out of their own way, focusing too
Hmm.
much on their enterprise execution systems and not looking at these other new forms of intelligence that are coming from, multiple different tiers of the supply chain, different communities, and different forms of intelligence.
So let's talk a little bit about the life of the American tech importer because we source a lot of our tech from overseas, specifically China and those other Asian Pacific countries. If I'm an American importer, how has my life changed during the last year, and is it going to get any better? Obviously, lives have changed for the worst, especially when it comes to imports, but is there hope on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what's interesting is that the global electronics value chain is a broadly an indicator of globalization, right? So if you look at the American tech importer, really what you're looking at is either domestically focused American tech companies that are either importing products to just resell them and or going into their manufacturing process as their supply, and maybe they're selling to the domestic market or maybe they're selling globally. Most of the global manufacturers, though, may be U.S. headquartered, but their operations and manufacturing are global, right? So what we typically see is, you might have, import flows that are coming from, say, Chinese or other Asia Pacific markets, but then how they're treated from a trade tariff perspective, and then what their flows are at downstream can vary quite a lot, and it's highly interconnected. So what I would say is that the near-term issues are around a global component shortage that is not just impacting automotive, but many other electronics downstream markets. And that's particularly true in consumer electronics. I mean, we saw all the console shortages, with PlayStation 5, the new
Hmm.
Xbox. We see it indirectly happening, but consumers don't see it in big data centers. So all that tech is also used there. So we're going to see these shortages kind of play out. But then in the near term, the issue is scrambling, chasing parts, trying to find at whatever cost, where those key component parts are. I think in the medium term is where we're going to see companies rethink their strategy even more and try to find, how do I reduce risk, either at products at the point of design, or how do I operationally manage my supply chain through alternate sources of strategic inventory buffers, maybe partnering with a 3PL or a contract manufacturer to manage like critical parts of my supply chain. And I'll pay a premium for that, because I know that I might be facing uncertainty and sort of crazy both lead time and cost. And so, how do I buffer that risk is the new way of thinking about this.
So if I'm a consumer, other than, having to wait 16, 18 weeks for my brand new PS5 or starting to order my electronic Christmas presents now at the beginning of May, where can I
Right.
expect to feel some of those impacts?
Well, I mean, I think that, if you look at it broadly, it's all really about balancing supply and demand, and it's about upstream capacity coming online of particularly foundry capacity. So a lot of these semiconductor chips that we buy and are critical to these, PlayStation consoles or whatever they are, these consumer tech devices that we love, they're really being impacted by the availability of either custom or standard key components that are made by or designed by leading semiconductor companies, which the majority of which are fabless, meaning they rely on a key foundry partner, which is where you have this inverted diamond in the electronics value chain. You have this huge amount of parts and components, but they're all at the semiconductor level sourced through a limited number of foundries, either companies like TI and Intel that have their own foundry capacity, or companies that work with a TSMC, a USMC, UMC, et cetera, to build Samsung to build those chips. That foundry capacity is really the most important indicator of where we'll see a normal market and have expected lead times as consumers. And we're not going to live in that environment for at least the number, I would say, not just this year, but the next year full holiday cycle is where we're going to see things normalize a little bit more in general. But the very specific products will have very specific challenges still in the short term.
hmm That's crazy to think. It's crazy that we're already talking about a 2021 holiday buying cycle when it seems like small parcel delivery is
Yeah,
still trying to catch up from the 2020 cycle. And
right.
UPS just posted earnings that was out of the water for Q1, and it's like there's this tidal wave of momentum still continuing on, and it's like when is it going to stop, if it is going to stop ever?
Well, it's interesting. It's really hard. It's murky, right? To sort of have the crystal ball and try to predict things with accuracy because we've had such a perfect storm. I mean, in my entire career within supply chain, I've never seen a confluence of these many risk factors and dynamics playing out on a global stage as
hmm
intensely as it is right now. And when I talk to experts on specific, areas of the supply chain around what they're seeing, many of them kind of come to the same conclusion, which is, look, this specific issue where we're watching like a hawk right now might normalize, but it's going to be like whack-a-mole. I mean, the
hmm
constraints and the dynamics are going to take a long time, if ever, to sort of normalize a little bit. And, really, I think it comes down to the demand mix changes that we saw that were so dramatic with COVID, right? Such an external impact, right? I mean, automotive demand went down, projected 80% because
hmm
they weren't sure, right? Where people are going to buy cars again and when. And we saw consumer tech and home tech, education tech go through the roof. When you got massive demand mix changes, this is what's happening with our global supply chains. It's not very resilient and it takes months for it to work out and rebalance. I think if we are not seeing constant, crazy external pandemic impacts, we'll see a new normal, but it's going to be a constrained and sort of rapidly evolving new normal for a while.
hmm
And I think that's what people are having a hard time getting their head wrapped around, is that this is not a short term, challenge that we'll just get through in a couple months.
Right. So one of those disruption factors that we can talk about was the change of administration and the way that the bureaucratic kind of climate, I guess, plays into the way that we interact with some of those imports, exports, and those trade regulations. Talk to me a little bit about what the changing presidency and the new Biden administration has done with some of the supply chain visibility and with those tech needs.
Well, I think it's early days with the Biden administration. I think by executive order, you've seen, a prioritization and an area of focus that's really, in my opinion, refreshing, because there's a view of, let's study, global supply chains and, the risk to, security, U.S. security based on dependencies that might exist. And, a lot of supply chain professionals would be like, we don't need 100 days to study this. We can tell you exactly what's going on. But it's important that the administration sort of getting kind of congressional oversight and building a holistic overview before announcing specific policy changes. I think Catherine Tai, the new U.S. Trade Representative, and leading kind of sort of indications of where their priorities are, is indicating what they want to look at, but they've not really announced any fundamental changes from the Trump administration sort of tariff policy.
hmm
Uh, with some short-term changes they're making with respect to sort of Europe, but China, for example, remains sort of status quo. I do think, though, that one of the things that Catherine Tai is talking about as part of the administration is really important, which is this observation that generally trade wars benefit no one philosophically, right, and in principle. And second, that the biggest issue, and I really believe this is true, is lack of predictability, transparency, and planning. When you've got these external tariffs that are announced and then implemented overnight, like what we saw during the Trump administration, the biggest issue is the uncertainty of how to absorb and where it's going and what the impact and how long all of these changes will be. So you can really minimize the disruption impacts by pre-announcing, planning, having transparency around the approach, defining specific thresholds for when things might move or change in the future, with greater, even with greater sort of clarity. With very limited changes in the current trade policy, I think things would improve. But I would obviously like us to see, a new approach to priorities around those trade, because we're not seeing generally a lot of benefit, and U.S. consumers are essentially paying a higher premium for the cost of those tariff policies.
Right. So that kind of covers where we can look for the future, what we should need and should ask out of our representatives on the government level. From a manufacturing level, as far as those changes in supply chain visibility go, if I'm looking towards the future, what is crucial for me to understand? What is crucial for me to look at and say, hey, this is the most important thing to pick out going forward into the future, and this is what I need to keep my eye on?
Well, I think one real insight that we have through industry survey work and working with key executives in key manufacturers in different industries that consume electronics content is that you really need to start root cause. You need to start at where you're designing in risk and resiliency of your products, and that's in this design phase. Mm-hmm. So designing resiliency, at the point of design in these early stages is a really critical move that many companies are not focused enough on, in our opinion, because that's where you're locking in the life cycle cost and risk for these products, sometimes up to 70-80% of its life cycle cost and risk. I think the other key focus is constantly having an outside-in view, because the truth is out there. It's not in your company. Typically, the data set, the information you're using is stale, it's old, it's static, and it only represents history, your transaction history, and your view of the world. We've got global interconnected value chains, really, that are constantly shifting. So if we can absorb intelligence from the outside in and then constantly be looking at, okay, what are leading indicators of demand changes, of lead time change? How can I design out or measure risk and the return on resiliency in my organization? That really gets into how you use new forms of intelligence. And it's really about finance changing the rules of the road so that other decision makers in the company, whether it's in engineering or procurement or supply chain, have the right ability to manage trade-offs and get credit for that. Because part of the problem is we're talking a lot about risk and we're measuring risk. And then at the end of the day, lowest cost for procurement is the most important thing, or engineers are only being, measured on get that product out design-wise on time and launch it to market. But then I'm not looking at my ability to go to scale, right? Mm-hmm. Post-launch. Those are the fundamental issues that are silo-driven, that leaders need to break those silos apart and redefine success and how to operationalize risk management in those decisions there.
Awesome, Richard. Well, that was great and so informative. Thank you so much for joining me today on At Your Doorstep. If people want to learn a little bit more about SupplyFrame, what you guys do, where should they go?
Just go to supplyframe.com and you can access studies, videos, white papers, et cetera, on our resource center, or just engage with us and we'd be happy to have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much again. You want to find out more about some of the top headlines that are making waves on modernshipper.com? You can start with these. Modern Shipper managing editor Brian Straight writes that there are new challenges coming, like transparency and shipping speed for e-commerce. More and more purchasing is happening in those digital spaces, so e-commerce retailers really need to get a good idea of what their customers are looking for in order to maximize that fulfillment. We just wrapped up our Drone Waves Summit, and now the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is talking about how they're deploying drones in rural areas to survey tornado damage. FreightWaves meteorologist Nick Austin writes about that on modernshipper.com. And after a 2020 that was a world of success for gig workers, Grubhub is surprisingly posting a loss in their first quarter earnings. They reported a 56-cent per share loss when they expected a 1 cent per share gain. You can find all of those headlines and more on modernshipper.com. Catch At Your Doorstep every Tuesday at 2 p.m. or on a podcast player of your choice.